Hey guys, welcome back. This is day 9. Today we're going to talk about moral, legal, and aesthetic reasoning. Um, these are all essentially the maybe the most interesting and fun things to argue about, and maybe also the most important. Right? It's essentially questions of what's right, what's wrong, what should be legal, and what is good art. Right? We're also going to use this opportunity to essentially look at how do you make arguments about these things. It's one thing to have an opinion about these things, it's another thing, really, to kind of back that up with an argument. And all three of these things essentially work the same way in terms of how you argue them. They're called evaluative or normative argumentation. Right? We're also going to use this time to focus on making our arguments more complicated. We're going to move on to complex arguments, which we talked about before, but this time we're going to get a little more into them. Okay, so starting with what is a ethical question? So imagine, let's say that you have a boyfriend that is in the armed forces, and they're overseas, and they've been gone for a long time, and you're lonely, and somebody asks you out. Is it okay for you to go out with somebody else even though you are in a committed relationship? That's an ethical question, right? And most people have a pretty quick reply to that, which is either no, it's not, or yes, it is because. And notice the because means that you're going to give some reasons as to why. Now, look at the other picture. Say your 4-year-old daughter was suddenly diagnosed with a fatal kidney problem, and there just aren't enough kidneys to go around, as is the case. She's gonna die, but you happen to know somebody in the administration that can essentially bump her up the list, right? List of donors, so that she'll get a kidney earlier than somebody else. This will essentially mean that she will live, but because of your actions, somebody else, just as innocent, is going to die. Right? Is it okay for you to do that? In fact, as a father, do you have to do that? Okay, again, right? This is the realm of moral reasoning. Then we have the question of, okay, so what sort of laws should we have, right? Should we, let's say, have laws about abortion or not? So what should those laws be? Should people have to do things like wear seatbelts or helmets if they're driving motorcycles? What are the laws? And finally, what is good art? Who is the best artist? So in this picture, if you look to the bottom left, you see essentially the American Idol contenders here. And what do shows like American Idol do? Well, essentially, they ask the question, who's the best artist? In this case, let's say the best vocalist or the best performer. And they, well, evaluate them, right? And they each give reasons as to why they thought this person was better than that person. Also, if you look to the Armut picture, yes, that is a urinal. Um, in 1917, the French artist Marcel Duchamp decided to buy a urinal, write Armut 1917 on it, and put it in a gallery. Essentially, well, causing, as you can imagine, a very big stir in the art world as people argued ferociously about whether this was or was not art. So, one of the questions of aesthetics is really, is it even art? Okay, now all of these involve value judgments, right? So, a value judgment is something that assesses the merit, desirability, or praiseworthiness of someone or something. So, here's a bunch of, let's say, moral value judgments. Parents should take good care of their children. It's wrong to lie, especially to your friends. That's a cowardly act. Or you should donate more to charity, right? Notice all of these things are making assumptions about what's good and bad, and they're making judgments about whether what you're doing is good or bad. And of course, we have lots of non moral value judgments. It's way too hot today, right? Is judging the weather and whether it's good or not. That song sucks is an aesthetic judgment. I should be allowed to smoke marijuana is a legal judgment. The Wire is the best TV show ever. It's an aesthetic judgment, and if you've never seen The Wire, you should definitely watch The Wire. Now, all of these judgments, if you're going to back them up in some way, essentially involve the same kind of evaluative reasoning. So there's this common structure to all of them. It essentially all involves what's called a major premise, and it's going to be this general principle that's going to apply wrong across essentially a range of cases. And a minor premise, that's your second premise. And now you got a specific case, and you're going to relate that to the principle that you just talked about. And finally, your conclusion is how the principle applies to the case. So here's how this would work, let's say, with an ethical judgment. Premise one, it's wrong to cheat on someone you're having a serious relationship with. Premise two, a romantic online only relationship is a form of cheating. That's the kind of relationship where you never actually met somebody, you only met them online, but it is romantic. So it's wrong to have such online relationships if you're in a serious relationship. Okay? See what the argument does? It essentially begins with this big principle. It's wrong to cheat on someone you're having a serious relationship. And then it takes a specific case, right? A romantic online only relationship. And essentially it sees if it's okay to have that with somebody if you're in a serious relationship. And it concludes because of the principle that it's not. Okay? The same exact thing is going to work for, let's say, aesthetic judgment. So any film that's fun to watch and makes you feel good about the world is worth watching. Fast and Furious 8 is fun to watch and it makes you feel good about the world. So Fast and Furious 8 is worth watching. Again, notice we started with a principle, and this principle essentially set out a condition, right? If a film is fun to watch and makes you feel good about the world, then it's worth watching. And then it essentially said Fast and Furious 8 is such a film, so it meets the condition, so it is worth watching. And again, with a legal argument, the government only has a right to limit people's freedom to prevent them from harming others. Not wearing a seatbelt is not an action that harms anybody else, so the government doesn't have a right to disallow me to drive without a seatbelt. Okay? Again, same thing. A principle about what the laws should be about, what the laws should include, a specific case, and a conclusion about how it relates to the principle. Okay, so are these deductive or inductive argument? Remember the difference is that deductive arguments essentially try to prove something. And notice with all of these, the conclusion is 100% clear, right? It's not like this is probably true. It's always this is definitely true. And notice the idea is if the principle is true, if it's true that the government only has a right to limit people's freedom to prevent them from harming others, and it really is true that not wearing a seatbelt doesn't harm anybody, then it seems 100% true that the government doesn't have a right to ban you from driving without a seatbelt. Okay, again, notice all of these arguments are going to work in the same way. The next thing we're going to talk about are some of the principles that people actually use to, well, argue their points about, legal, moral, and aesthetic judgments. Now, if you understand these, you could probably understand like 90% of the conversation that goes on about morality and the law. Now, before we get to that, all three of them essentially involve, well, two basic principles that all value reasonings have to engage in. The first is the consistency principle. Essentially, the idea here is that if separate cases are not different in any relevant way, then they should be treated the same way. So treat cases the same if they're the same. The second is the burden principle, and essentially says that if someone appears to be violating this consistency, then the burden is on them to show that really there is an important difference between the two cases. Now, look at this. So we're going to look at examples again from, legal, moral, and aesthetic reasoning. Here's an argument. People should be allowed to own guns of limited destructive capacity. Handguns are such guns, but machine guns are too destructive. So people should be allowed to own handguns, but not machine guns. Notice what the argument does, right? So let's say I think that the two guns at the edges, which are handguns, should be legal, but not the middle gun, which is a machine gun. What essentially the argument is doing is drawing a difference between them, right? People should be allowed to own guns of limited destructive capacity. That's the relevant difference. And because handguns have that, they're okay, but machine guns don't have that, so they're not okay. So people should be allowed to own handguns, but not machine guns. Okay, here's another one. Any film that's fun to watch and makes you feel good about the world is worth watching. Both Fast and Furious 6 and 7 are fun to watch, but only 6 makes you feel good about the world. So, Fast and Furious 6 is worth watching, but 7 is not. Again, right, we're drawing a distinction between the two. In this case, essentially, that one movie is fun and the other one, one movie makes you feel good about the world and the other one doesn't. And that's a good reason to think that one is worth watching, but the other one isn't. And finally, the government has a duty to protect children from neglectful parents that place them in danger. Leaving a young child in a car for 5 minutes with the windows closed is dangerous on a hot day, but not on a cool one. Okay, so notice the distinction there. The government, therefore, should not allow parents to leave kids in cars on hot days, but should allow them to do this on cool ones. Right? This is a big deal for parents. It's hard to not leave a kid in a car if you got to run home really quick. Essentially, it draws a distinction between doing so on a hot day and a cold day. So sometimes it should be okay, and sometimes it should not be okay. Okay, again, notice what all these arguments are doing are drawing a distinction because cases that are alike need to be treated alike. If you're going to say that two cases that might seem similar should be treated differently, the burden is on you to say what is different about them and how does that relate to them being treated differently. Now we'll get to the actual principles for moral and legal reasoning, and we'll start with moral reasoning. A moral principle is essentially it's a moral value judgment that's general. So it's a principle that applies to a bunch of cases that are all supposed to be similar. We're going to talk about four. These are the four really big ones. The first one is consequentialism. Consequentialism is just like the name says, it's all about consequences. So the right thing to do is whatever action will bring about the best consequences to the world, right? So it's overall consequences. So you think essentially about how your action is going to impact everybody. So let's say I find out that my best friend's wife is cheating on him, right? Should I tell him? Consequentialism is essentially going to say, well, before you do, you really want to think about how is everybody going to be impacted by this, right? My friend is married, he has 2 kids, he loves his wife, she sure seems to love him. What would happen if I told him about the affair? I mean, what would happen if I didn't tell him about the affair? Now, notice, right, I have to think about what's going to be the impact on him, the kids, his wife in the short run and the long run. And whichever option I think is going to result in the best consequences is going to be the overall right option. Okay? Deontology, on the other hand, doesn't really focus on consequences. Instead, it really focuses on rules. So essentially, the idea here is we have to do whatever it is that we have a duty, an obligation to do. So in the example I just gave you, you might think, well, I have an obligation to protect my friend from harm. Therefore, let's say I shouldn't tell him. Or I have an obligation to be truthful and forthright with my best friend. So my obligation is to tell him. I shouldn't keep anything away from him, no matter what the consequences are. Okay? Then we have what's called cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is a very simple kind of theory. And the idea of it is essentially is that whether an act is right or wrong really depends on one's culture. So the idea is essentially X is right if my culture says that X is right. So think of, let's say, the death penalty. In China, the cultural norms say that the death penalty is just fine. So the death penalty is right for China. But in, let's say, Germany, the moral norms are quite different. The moral norms there say that the death penalty is inhumane, right? It's very wrong. So the death penalty is right for China, but wrong for Germany. Okay, the final one that we'll use is religious absolutism. So religious absolutism, which should be really familiar to everybody, essentially says the correct moral principles are those of the correct religion, or whatever the right interpretation of God's wishes is going to be essentially the right thing to do. Right? Religious absolutism applies to any situation where essentially you have some sort of religious mandate. So let's say you're Catholic and you're considering having an abortion. Well, the Catholic interpretation of, let's say, God's wishes is going to say that that is morally impermissible. Therefore, according to religious absolutism, it is wrong for you to have an abortion, or it is wrong for anybody to have an abortion. It's not about what religion you believe in, it's more like the religion is giving the reason for what's right and what's wrong. Next, we have legal reasoning. And legal reasoning, exactly as it sounds, is all about what sort of laws we should have. And obviously, people fiercely debate this question. There's a lot at stake at this question, given that the laws we have affect really everybody. And we're going to talk about, again, four ways to think about this. The first one is legal moralism. So, legal moralism is very straightforward. It's essentially look, if something is immoral, it should be illegal. So, murder, wrong. So, it should be illegal. Stealing people's stuff, wrong. So, it should be illegal. Adultery, wrong. So, it should be illegal. The next one is the harm principle. The harm principle, I brought it up earlier already, essentially is the idea that the only legitimate basis for legally forbidding anything is that that thing causes harm to others, right? So, can I go and hit someone with a baseball bat? No, right? That's harm. Can I hack into someone's account and steal their money? Well, no, that causes them harm. Can I bully someone until they have a nervous breakdown? Well, no, that causes harm. Can I drink poison? Well, I'm not harming anybody else. Right? Now, notice I could be potentially indirectly harming somebody in the sense that someone might be harmed by what I'm doing. So, for example, let's say I decide to drink poison and die. Right? My family might be really sad about that. In some sort of indirect sense, you might say that my act is harming them. But that's not the way the harm principle is usually taken to be. It's usually taken to be the sort of direct harm we've already talked about, right? So, me, let's say, taking my own life is essentially me not really directly harming anybody else. Um, Me deciding to do heroin, as long as I'm not going out and doing anything to anybody else, well, that's just fine, right? Me deciding to well, let's say me deciding to paint my house a really, really ugly color. Right? What about that one? It's an interesting case, right? So let's say you're my neighbor, right? And you really, really don't like this house that's now across from you. It's causing you, visual pain, aesthetic pain every time you see it. You're like, this thing is ruining the neighborhood. It's ruining my enjoyment. In fact, it's harming my enjoyment of my surroundings. That probably wouldn't count as direct harm under the harm principle. This is why there are lots of neighborhoods that have laws about how you can paint your house. Um, but under the harm principle, that is usually permissible. Now, this goes even further, right? So let's say not only do you not like looking at my house, but now your property values have gone down, right? Because who wants to live next to that house that looks like crap? So it seems that you're being harmed, but again, you're not being harmed by me. You're being harmed by other people's perceptions, in this case, of what this house would be worth. Okay? So the harm principle is pretty restrictive in terms of what the government can essentially tell you can't do. It's only when it's going to harm other people. Okay, then we have the third one. The third one is legal paternalism. Paternalism like father. So think of essentially the government as acting like a father or a mother figure. And the idea here is that laws can be justified if they prevent a person from doing harm to him or herself. Think of your parents, right? They essentially don't allow you to do a bunch of things that they think would be harmful for you. That's part of the idea of what good parenting is. And there's laws like that as well. So think of, let's say, the seatbelt law, for example, or let's say laws that force you to wear helmets, or let's say laws that force you to save for retirement. Um, Now, all of these essentially, at least directly, appear to be laws that are there for your own good, right? They stop you from doing something else. Like, let's say I was in an accident before the seatbelt law, and I hurt my jaw really bad. I had TMJ for many, many years. Had there been a law that forced me to do that, I wouldn't have done that. I would have been okay. My friend that was with me wore a seatbelt and he was just fine. So a law like this would have benefited me. It's for my own good. And the government looks at that and says, okay, we need a law that essentially does this. That said, things are not always so simple. So think, for example, of the seatbelt law. Part of the real motivation for the seatbelt law was if I get into an accident, so the accident I got into before the seatbelt law essentially required me getting surgery, which wouldn't have happened if I was to wear a seatbelt. And who paid for that surgery? Well, my insurance company. Well, that means other people really paid for that surgery in terms of the premiums that they paid for their insurance company. And the people that didn't have insurance, well, the state paid for them, or rather, taxpayers paid for them. So, in a sense, if everybody wore their seatbelt, you would have better overall outcomes. And if someone wasn't wearing a seatbelt, there's a sense where you can say they were harming other people. Okay, last one. Last one is the offense principle. The offense principle essentially stops you from doing things that are generally considered offensive. So a law can be justified if X causes great offense to others. Why can't you walk around naked? Well, because people generally view it as offensive. Some people will say, well, it's to protect children, but what exactly are you protecting children from, if not, let's say, from being offended? You can think of other things that in many places you're not allowed to do, right? In many places, you're not allowed to do, let's say, speak badly about the king or the ruler because that's considered offensive to the country. In many places, you're not allowed to say things that are religiously offensive or racially offensive, right? The idea is that because they're offensive, essentially they're causing a sort of harm, and we don't want the kind of society where people do that, so we're going to pass a law that restricts them from doing so. Now, if you look at the discussion, right, the public discussion about what sort of laws we should have, you'll notice that virtually every conversation focuses on one of these four reasons. Now we get to the question of what is good art? Notice here we got two Mona Lisas. We got, let's say, the classic Mona Lisa on the right, and we got duck-faced Mona Lisa in the middle. Which one is better? Now, think about it. How do you judge which one is better? What are you going to look for here? Well, let's start with the classic, right? So the classic is, well, it's famous. Maybe we might say that just being famous makes a good art. Some people have. It takes a lot of technical proficiency, right? It's not easy to make a painting like that. It's got a certain something to it, right? People swear by the enigmatic smile and the eyes that seem to follow you everywhere you go. Maybe at the time it was also something that moved the art world forward, right? Maybe it was an artistic innovation, the way Da Vinci did it. Now, look at our duck face in the middle. What's happening there? Well, essentially, most people can do this in Photoshop, right? Essentially, you mesh together two pictures, you added a different face over the Mona Lisa, and you added the iPhone, right? Lots and lots of people can do this. It's not technically difficult, right? So it loses out on that. The Mona Lisa is an original. This one is a derivative, right? This person didn't really have to think very hard about it, right? Didn't have to come up with anything sort of original. The original one is enigmatic. This one is just kind of silly. But maybe we could also go the other way, right? The original may not really speak to today's audience, and maybe what you need to be a good artist to be able to speak to people. And the one in the middle, let's say, can speak to people. Maybe it makes a social commentary about the way we relate to technology today. Or maybe it's just funny and, art should be fun. Maybe art should be something we enjoy. Now, notice you could potentially make arguments for both of them. Okay? The trick is to think of some sort of principle that you can use to do that. Now, there's lots of principles for determining aesthetic value. I just grabbed a few here just as samples. So first, um, let's say art is good if it's meaningful or teaches us a truth. So think of something like poetry, especially, right? The idea that poetry can communicate truth that you just can't do in some other ways, right? That it's a unique way of communicating some really important truth about life, and that makes it meaningful. Second, if it has the capacity to convey values or beliefs that are important to the culture or artist that made it, this is a sort of communicative theory of art, right? Where the idea is that the artist is essentially um, managing to convey to you, right, how she or he feels about this particular issue. And if it's successful, right, so you are essentially connected to the values or beliefs of that person, you understand where they're coming from, then that ability to communicate becomes, well, what's really good about it as a piece of art. Third, it has the capacity to bring about social or political change. Uh, in the 20th century, this was a particularly big thing, especially among communist nations. But it's also been a form of art that was essentially big anywhere where social movements and social justice were a big thing. The idea is that the art itself can become helpful in motivating people, right? Bringing them together, getting them to pursue a better world. Number four, it has the capacity to produce pleasure in those who experience or appreciate them, right? That art itself could be enjoyable, and the more enjoyable it is, as well, wow, that was interesting. That's something I see every day. Um, think of a lot of films that are really works of art, and primarily they're just there to be enjoyed. Okay, five. If it has the capacity to produce certain emotions that we value. Now, think about these emotions like empathy, like sorrow or sadness, um, or great joy, right? These things that they don't just come to you, but great art can make you feel, right? Oneness with people. Or maybe, let's say, non emotion experiences that are really special, like this feeling of autonomy, of freedom that you can get, right? You can again think of watching a movie and you feel empowered by what you just watched, right? That's giving you a feeling of autonomy that's really special. Or maybe the willing suspension of disbelief. Think of special effect art, right? It literally gets you to just accept that you're in another world. That's really amazing, and it's an amazing experience to have that kind of feeling. And then there's of course the view that my sister used to say this about her preschoolers, that essentially any art that the preschoolers made was essentially as good as any art in a museum, because look, aesthetic beauty is just not the sort of thing that anybody could argue about. There really is no standard. Essentially, if you think it's good, then it's good. Okay? Notice this essentially conflicts with all the others. Um, that said, when we look at a work of art, a lot of times we look at a whole bunch of different things that we might think really are important for a work of art in that medium. And sometimes a work of art can be really good because it excels in one of these, though more often it's that it excels in a number of these. Now we're going to look at essentially two ways to create stronger evaluative arguments. And that means, well, here's the kind of arguments that we've talked about so far, right? So we've applied them to moral, legal, and aesthetic situations. And for each of these, we had a principle and we had a case and we applied the principle to the case. But how can we build on that, right? How can we make the arguments even stronger? And for this, we're going to move to complex arguments. So the first approach is going to be to focus on the minor premise, right? So the idea is the minor premise says it's a specific case in question is going to fall under the principle. So the first approach is we're going to provide support for that. We're going to show that the case in question really is the kind that would fit under the principle, like the argument says it does. The second approach is going to focus on the principle itself, right? we're going to give reasons for why the principle is the right way to think about cases in this kind of situation. Okay, so how do we create these complex arguments? Here's the first way. So you start with this, right? A principle that claims that if something has properties or property X, Y, and Z, then it can be said to have or be Q. Then a claim that something, a case, a situation, an object, etc., really does have those properties, and from that we're going to conclude that this thing has or is Q. So this is we're supporting the minor claim. Right? Then we're going to bring in our principle, right? So 4 is a principle that states that if something has or is Q, then it's M. And from that, we're going to reach a final conclusion that therefore this thing is M. Okay, that might sound really technical, but I'm going to give you a bunch of arguments, sample arguments now to see how this works. So let's say we're arguing about the practice of taking away the ability to vote for convicted felons. Here's how a complex argument would work for this. If a law doesn't allow people to vote about how things should work in their own communities, then those communities are deprived of their voices, which is harmful to those communities. Premise 2, California's AB 37, which I made up, does not allow convicted felons to vote about how things should work in their communities. So, California's AB 37 is harmful to those communities. So notice what we did so far is we established that it is harmful to those communities. Now we add the principle. If a law is harmful to those communities, then it should be repealed. So AB 37 should be repealed. Okay, so notice what the additional part, the regular arguments, the syllogisms that we did before would have been just premises 3, 4, conclusion 5. Instead, we added something above that. And what we added was evidence that the AB 37 really is harmful to communities. Okay, so that it fits under the principle. Okay, here's one essentially about President Trump and the idea of conflicts of interest. So, if someone is acting as an agent responsible for other people's goods, then they have a conflict of interest whenever he or she must make a decision between their interests and his or her own. Right? The idea here is conflict of interest is a very, very common term in lots and lots of businesses. If you're a lawyer, you can't represent, let's say, both parties in a conflict because you're supposed to do your best for each of those parties. If you're an accountant, you can't invest in a company that you are essentially doing accounting for because you have a conflict of interest between making money for yourself and essentially doing your duties for your company. There's lots and lots of there's a whole lot of laws about conflicts of interest. Okay, second, as president, Trump often faces decisions which weigh the interests of the public against his own business interests. All right, so this happens if you have a business and you, let's say, are involved in creating laws or policies that can affect those businesses. So, as president, Trump faces conflicts of interest. Okay, so notice what we've done so far, right? In the first 3, essentially, we've established that as president, Trump faces conflicts of interest. We didn't just start with that. We didn't just start with that as a conclusion. We gave reasons for why one should think that he does face conflicts of interest. 4, it's wrong for a president not to remove conflicts of interest by placing his business in a trust. So, 5, it's wrong for Trump not to place his businesses in a trust. Okay, again, what we would have done before is just 3, 4, 5. Now we've got support for 3. All right, last one. This one is about MTV Vocalist Awards, right? So, number 1, the key technical aspects of good singing are good vocal tone, control, versatility, range, and consistency. Lady Gaga demonstrated more of these traits than any other vocalist this year, so Lady Gaga excels in the technical aspects of good singing more than any other vocalist this year. Okay? Again, notice what we've done so far is we've supported the claim that she's better at the technical stuff than anybody else this year. Now comes our principle. The MTV Music Awards should reward the best singer of the year by looking at their technical aspects. Now, our principle obviously applies to this. So, MTV should give her the Best Singer Award. All right, again, you see, in all of these, what we do is we are giving reasons why the case is as we say it is, and then just applying the principle. Now, the second way is a little bit different. The second way essentially works on the principle, and it goes like this. Um, it begins with a claim that a principle addressing situation X is, or let's say should do, Y. Then you got a claim that principle Q is addressing situation X. So, a conclusion that principle Q is or should do Y. Then you have four. Now you got the case, right? A specific case is presented, stated in relation to the principle, and again, the final conclusion that the case is or is not or should not Y. Again, this is the technical part. Let me give you examples. So we're back to the same issues, and now instead of supporting the principle, instead of supporting the claim, we're going to support the major premise, the principle. So first of all, okay, if a law punishes someone for committing a crime, even after they do their time in jail, then it's unjust and should be repealed. Laws that do not allow people to vote after coming out of jail are such laws. So, laws that do not allow people to vote after coming out of jail are unjust and should be repealed. Okay? Again, notice we are supporting the third one. Why are they unjust and should be repealed? Because, as one says, they are punishing someone even after they did their time in jail. Right? It's giving you a reason, and it's essentially applying it to that reason. Then we got our case. California's AB 37 is such a law, and that means it's unjust and should be repealed. Okay? The same thing is going to apply to our law, our argument about conflicts of interest. So it's wrong for presidents not to do everything in their power to remove a conflict of interest between their personal interests and those of the public, which they aim to serve. Trump is a president. So it's wrong for him not to do everything in his power to remove a conflict of interest between his personal interests and those of the public. Placing his businesses in a trust would remove such a conflict of interest and is in his power. So it's wrong for him not to place his businesses in a trust. Okay, again, same thing. By the third one, we've essentially got our principle. It's wrong not to do everything in your power to get rid of this. Then we have the specific case, which would remove conflicts of interest and is in his power. So, applied to the case, it seems that it's wrong for him not to do so. And finally, the MTV Awards. Awards for singers should focus on the technical aspects of what makes for good vocalists. The MTV Music Awards is an award for singers, so the MTV Music Awards should reward the best singer of the year by looking at their technical aspects. Lady Gaga excels on these technical aspects more than any other contender this year. So MTV should give her the Best Singer award. Okay. Again, notice unlike the last time, we are supporting the principle, and we're supporting it essentially by saying this is how award shows in general work, and this is an award show, so it should work in this particular way. Now, if you wanted to make even better arguments, you could, of course, do both of these things. You can support the premise and support the conclusion, and then you would have a really good argument. All right, I am going to be expecting you to be able to make an argument like this, and we will do one in class, or several, hopefully, in class. So, what did we learn today? Essentially, we started talking about the idea of a value judgment, right? That you're making this sort of judgment that something is good or not, right? Praiseworthy or not. We talked about the way arguments like this are formed, right, with a major, minor premise that has a principle. We looked at the two value principles for essentially dealing with any evaluative cases, the consistency principle and the burden principle. We looked at the four most common moral principles, right? The idea of consequentialism, deontology, cultural relativism, and religious absolutism. We looked at the four most common legal principles: legal moralism, the harm principle, legal paternalism, and the offense principle. And then we looked at some of the many principles there are for considering what is good art. I'm not going to hold you responsible for those, but I am going to hold you responsible for the rest. Um, Now we finished with the idea of complex arguments and how do you make complex arguments? How do you essentially add more so that your argument is even stronger? Um, Now, beef up on these, and in class we'll do more of that. Meanwhile, don't forget to go on to Google Classroom and take your quiz, and I'll see you in class.